Dr. Leighton has worked as a research scientist at the Western Regional Research Laboratory for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Berkeley, California. So you're tying Dr. Leighton is Chief of Biochemistry and Director of Chemical Warfare for the United States Army at a time that we had MK-Ultra being started.
But then you said earlier that you thought Leighton might have been under drugs and he might have had blanks in his gun. Would they have done that with his father?
The blanks in the gun would fit there because then they could prove he didn't fire anything, right?
But what about him being on drugs and then experiments?
I don't know. I'm only postulating here. I'm only guessing. But, you know, what's interesting to me is the way that this Blakey family is so tied into everything. And when you have key operatives, if you do have operatives, they have to be pretty tightly held, your key people.
Do you have any theories about Tim and Grace Stone that fit into this at all?
I don't know about Tim Stone. I know that Tim was, I saw a picture of Tim as a young man picked up in East Germany, in East Berlin, back in the mid-50s, as a student back there. Then he came back here and he gave up his Porsche and he gave up his good job and he went and joined Jim Jones. And the big fight that supposedly caused this, was given as a reason for the blow-up at Jonestown, was over this, whose son it was and all. So I'm getting to the point where I can't really tell legitimate, as I say in here, legitimate suspicion from paranoia. So you start looking at everybody and wondering. And I just don't know.
Thank you.
Let the night roll with it. They're out there. They're out there. They're listening. Let the night roll with it.
You're listening to Hard Rain on KALX Berkeley.
Let the night roar, because they can hear us. They know we mean it. We'll kill them as they come.
Actually, you're not listening to. You're not listening to KALX. You are listening, of course, to KFJC. That just happened to be the broadcast in which that particular edited version was aired. And again, thanks to Eric Siegel, who edited that version together and whose voice you heard in voiceover, more or less the narrator, I guess, at the beginning and the end of the broadcast.
Worth noting for FCC purposes here that we do have the station's permission to play that, and that KALX is a sister station to this station, sharing the same faculty advisor.
Indeed, and good folks too. On top of that, okay, a couple of things real quickly to address. And again, the subject of Jonestown as a whole is something that we are going to want to address at much greater length, and will probably be perhaps an entire Radio Free America broadcast. One of the things, a kind of a canny point that was brought up by a young woman, who the only time I think that she spoke during the thing of the people who are listening to this press conference by Jill Holtzinger, which was if Lawrence Leighton Sr. had these contacts into U.S. military biochemical warfare and things like that, and was a bigwig as he was, why would Larry Leighton Jr. wind up in the middle of this thing and perhaps to be accused of murder, etc., etc.? Well, can't answer that one question particularly, but one of the interesting things that I've turned up, and Dave, we all have as we've researched this kind of stuff, is the number of times that people involved in these kinds of violent activities, these assassination attempts, these weird happenings, actually do turn out to be in important and connected families. Not just the Leightons, but for instance, the man who engineered the assassination of Orlando Letelier, who was a man by the name of Michael Vernon Townley, whose intelligence name was the Jackal. His family was an old CIA family that had been stationed in Santiago, Chile for many, many years, and had a long-standing participation in the CIA. It was a well-known fact. So Michael Vernon Townley became involved with the CIA and eventually became a contract assassin. John Hinckley Jr., of course, the man who took a shot at Ronald Reagan, and many of us feel under somewhat strange circumstances. His father is the leader of an organization called World Vision, a putatively religious and charitable organization that nonetheless has had many allegations of connections to the CIA, including Christian Century magazine flat out calling it a CIA front.
I don't know if he's actually the head guy, but he's one of the main officials.
I think you're right. I think he's on the board or something like that.
Yeah, because there's World Vision's getting a lot of publicity now in connection with the Ethiopian famine, and they usually have some other guy who's fronting as the head. So, but he is one of the driving forces behind the organization.
Right, and as I've mentioned several times in other shows, the Hinckleys are also well connected to the Bush family. George Bush, of course, former head of the CIA, and now our vice president.
Specifically, John Hinckley's older brother Scott was going to have dinner with Neil Bush, Vice President and former CIA Director Bush's son, the night after President Reagan was allegedly shot by John Hinckley, and they were also business partners.
Yeah, these things tend to be very, very incestuous, and so the fact that the Leighton family was highly connected and that Larry Leighton turned up in this sort of thing is not that surprising, and if we had the time, I would go into some other examples, but we really don't.
Summing up, though, some of the key details of what Mr. Holsinger, the Ryan aide, had to say. Note that the fact that initially there were 400 people reported dead. For 5 days they were looking for the other 500. No explanation as to there were 1,100 passports down to Guyana. Then the figure was reduced to 900. No explanation as to why that was reduced by 200. And they were looking for the other. They found 400 corpses. Were looking for the other 500 for 5 or 6 days, and then they said, "Oops, here they are. They were under the other 400 all the time. We just didn't notice." Take a look at George Philip Blakey, CIA operative, worked with the UNITA organization in Angola. He was the fellow who puts down the initial $650,000 down payment on the property in Guyana. Worth noting that the Angola operation was brought to a halt in part by the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, co-authored by Leo Ryan, which obliged the CIA to give Congress notification of impending covert operations. And take a look at the fact that Larry Leighton Sr. was director of biochemistry and chemical warfare at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. Interestingly, then he also worked on the Naval Rocket Propulsion Project, which I believe was in Annapolis, Maryland, or somewhere in Maryland. He also worked for the Department of Agriculture. And note that Larry Leighton Jr., his son, was the fellow who actually led the Port Kaituma death squad that killed Representative Ryan, among others. Larry Leighton Jr.'s sister, Debbie Leighton Blakey, was married to George Philip Blakey. Interestingly enough, the Phillip family, Lisa Phillip, eventually married Larry Leighton Sr. and became Mrs. Lawrence Leighton. She also joined the People's Temple. She came over from Germany, where her father was a lawyer for Siemens and Halske and also the IG Farben chemical conglomerate, which was an integral part of the Nazi war machine. They came over shortly before World War II. These are some of the key things to remember, and it's worth noting also that Mr. Holsinger's information came from, again, Mae Brussel, whose work is featured on this station.
Okay, a couple of other key details to tie up. During the course of the press conference, Joe Holsinger mentioned, and he didn't sound too actually sure about the original source for the information, but he mentioned that the Korean CIA had done the original funding to get the Unification Church, otherwise known as the Moonies, started on their road. Well, that particular information comes right out of the Tongson Park Korea Gate hearings that went on in the United States Congress and was originally published in the Toronto Star.
And also keep in mind, of course, that Richard Dwyer, CIA Chief of Mission, was at the Jonestown Massacre, and Jones was urging them to get him out of there.
Okay, one last thing, and we talked earlier in the show several times about the strange ways, the coincidences that these people keep showing up in, where William Bryan, the psychiatrist, happened to be in the same church with David Ferry, and things of this nature that keep cropping up here and again, and how somebody else in the Robert F. Kennedy assassination case just happened to be, one of his parishioners just happened to be the sister of Artie Bremer, who was the man who shot George Wallace. All kinds of other interesting things. Well, we mentioned also several connections to James Earl Ray, and between James Earl Ray and some of the people involved in these particular cases, and allegations of his involvement with hypnosis, particularly. Well, interestingly enough, we talked earlier in the show very briefly about the flimsiness of the case against James Earl Ray, and without wanting to rehash the entire Martin Luther King assassination, which we did talk about at some length on the Guns of November broadcast when we did them, but essentially the government's entire case that James Earl Ray was the assassin of Martin Luther King was based on the testimony of one eyewitness. This particular gentleman, whose name is Charles...
I always forget his name. Keep
okay,
talking.
Well,
come to me. I always forget his name.
Yeah, the name slipped my mind too. Anyway, this particular man, who was the only eyewitness that the government could get to pin James Earl Ray to the murder site from which supposedly Martin Luther King was shot.
Charles Q. Stevens.
Charles Q. Stevens. Charles Q. Stevens, according to his common-law wife Grace Walden, was in fact at the time of the assassination, and Charles Stevens himself had admitted this to other people, was so drunk that he had no idea, could possibly have had no idea of what had happened in the rooming house from which the shots were supposedly fired. Now, sometime after he had told this initial story, which was confirmed by mostly by his common-law wife, Grace Walden, he was gotten to by the FBI. He turned around and suddenly became the only witness who could associate James Earl Ray with the murder site, and claimed that he had in fact seen James Earl Ray run out of the room where the rifle was found and could identify him, etc., etc. Now, this in and of itself was interesting in the fact that this was the only witness that the government could put together. They kept him, this admitted alcoholic, in a hotel for $30,000 worth of time while they were getting ready for the trial. But, as we mentioned earlier, coincidence is a fascinating thing, and what happened to Grace Walden is an even more interesting story.
Basically, a woman from the People's Temple who had been killed in an automobile accident, her passport had been saved, and Mark Lane, now recall Mark Lane achieved a great deal of notoriety in connection with the assassinations. He is one of the very few people who the mainstream press have covered in his espousal of conspiracy theories behind this country's major political assassinations. Most researchers regard Mark Lane as what is known in the intelligence community as a vacuum cleaner, an intelligence agent sent out to scoop up information. He is generally regarded himself as a U.S. intelligence agent, also works marvelously to discredit the valid research that's been done in this regard. Now, Mark Lane was, at this time, an attorney representing People's Temple. He also, at the time of the Jonestown Massacre, was representing James Earl Ray when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was holding hearings into the assassinations of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. On November 18, 1978, when the massacre happened, the House Select Committee was in the middle of hearing testimony vis-a-vis the assassination of Martin Luther King, okay? And the Friday, as a matter of fact, before the Saturday of the massacre, a former FBI agent named Murtaugh, who had been stationed in the Atlanta FBI office, testified that when word came through that Dr. King had been shot, there was jubilation in the Atlanta FBI office, and that later on, that there was more jubilation when they heard he died. He talked about FBI harassment of King and of attempts to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide, and actually broke up in tears in the middle of the public hearings. That was one of the most dramatic moments in all of the hearings. Of course, now Mark Lane had been going on all sorts of stations, notably KGO here in the Bay Area, saying that Jonestown was a paradise on earth and so forth. And of course, he was saying that the government killed Martin Luther King and that James Earl Ray was innocent. Not only did Jonestown overshadow the Martin Luther King hearings, but after that, Mark Lane looks like God's own fool. After he said that People's Temple is a paradise on earth, it turned out to be a hell on earth, and so by implication he makes the James Earl Ray claim of innocence look bad. Now, Mark Lane, in his role as People's Temple attorney, had arranged for Grace Walden, or Grace Stevens, to go down on the passport of a woman who had been killed in an automobile accident to Jonestown. Had he been successful in doing that, she basically would have been at the Jonestown massacre, and the main witness in refuting the only witness to link James Earl Ray to the rooming house from which he allegedly shot Dr. King would have been gone with the wind.
Indeed. So, once again, as we've seen, coincidence plays strange tricks, and at a certain point you begin to wonder, what is coincidence? And indeed, that is probably the subject alone of most of the debate about what we're talking about tonight, because the facts are there. The only question is how much of the linkage are you willing to make? And I think willing is a good word, because this is pretty scary stuff. I think that mind control is probably the last great gaping hole in the consciousness of most Americans. They're beginning to be able to accept the fact that assassinations have taken place, that we are not the only nation on earth ever to have been free of political assassinations. However, mind control is still a pretty scary thing, and we've just begun to address it tonight. We're probably going to have to spend some more time on it, and this will be a good opportunity, perhaps, though, for you to talk with us about the state of where we've gone so far and some of the things that we've discussed and maybe some things that have interested you. We're going to take one last musical break while the phones are filling up. The line is 415-941-2500. Please call now, because as soon as this particular musical break ends, we are going to be going to the phones, and we will be staying on the phones uninterruptedly until 11 o'clock. So once again, the lines are now open. 415-941-2500 is the number. We look forward to hearing from you. This is Nip Tuck, along with Dave Emery, and we'll be back with the phone segment of Radio Free America in just a moment. Radio Free America, Mind Control Part 2. This is Nip Tuck. I'm here with Dave Emery, and we have got the phones open. 415-941-2500. We still have a couple of lines left open. I guess you guys are getting too smart for us out there, huh? You're not going to sit through the 6-minute songs while you're running up your phone bills. Well, we tried. Anyway, 415-941-2500 is the number. And again, since we do have a limited amount of time tonight for telephone calls, please try and keep your phone calls as short as possible, okay? That will help us, and it will help the other people out there who want to get on the phones.
We do have 2 open lines. So, if you want to call, and if those of you in particular, we get a lot of people who say they can't get through, they've been trying to call for weeks and weeks. Well, there are 2 open lines, so here's your chance.
Okay, anyway, back to the phone.